for this emergency dinner, which they called constructive and friendly. That's sort of diplomatic speak, isn't it? So what happens next? And if all these negotiations and dinners fail to make any progress and we leave the EU with no deal in place, here's the question: what does no deal actually mean? We've got the man, Professor Patrick Minford, Professor of Applied Economics at the Cardiff Business School. Good morning.
Good morning, Nicky.
Right, here we go. No deal. What does that mean?
Well, I think the first thing to realise is it means no trade deal. And obviously, there's got to be agreement on all sorts of nuts and bolts things, which would still be agreed on because we will be a sovereign state outside the EU dealing with the EU, which represents 27 other sovereign states. And there have to be agreements on things like aviation. They have to provide us with smooth customs procedures, and they have to recognize our standards and all sorts of other nuts and bolts things, which obviously will have to be agreed. And if they weren't agreed, that would be a breach of international law. But it's possible not to have a trade deal, and that's the key point. And that would mean we don't actually agree with the EU to have a special free trade agreement with them, as we plan to have with everybody else. Which that Theresa May's government have said they're going to go out and negotiate free trade agreements with other countries such as Australia, the US, New Zealand, South Korea, and the list goes on.
But people always say, well, they will still want our cars, those people on the Brexit side of the argument. But what about all the different car parts going between different countries in Europe? If you're talking nuts and bolts, will that not make cars more expensive, or will it?
Well, it depends really what happens. We probably, the government would, as far as we know, simply extend to the EU, and they would extend to us what's called normal or default tariffs. Actually, they got the name most favored nation tariffs, which are the tariffs you apply to everybody if you don't have a free trade agreement. And those, on average, for manufacturers are only 3.5%, which we need to get this in perspective. It's not a big amount. And also, you talk about all these car parts. They come in at about a 3.5 or 4% tariff. And in fact, that tariff's not payable at all at the end of the day if those parts are re-exported to another part of the world. So if they come into the UK, we don't actually charge anything on them at the end of the day, or we rebate it if it goes out again as an export. So that's all got to be kept in perspective. And when you do the calculations, it's really not a big amount. And it is obviously meaningful, but it's not a big amount. And so we need to be kept in perspective that 3.5% average tariff paid is a small amount. We would pay it on things we bought from the EU without a free trade deal with them. And they would pay it on the things they bought from us, without a free trade deal. So that would put up the prices of the things we bought from Europe in the way of manufacturers by 3.5% on average. And it would do the same to them with the stuff we sold to them. But our calculations are that this is really not going to have a big effect, provided we do free trade agreements with everybody else, because that'll bring down our prices for everything else, which at the moment are quite heavily protected by EU tariffs and other trade barriers, which push up their prices for food and manufacturers by about 20%, according to our calculations.
So the doom-mongers, doomsayers and naysayers who say that no deal is a kind of economic Armageddon are possibly way off the mark. But these free trade agreements that we have to put in place with everybody, how long does that take?
It can be quite quick. The Australian Prime Minister famously gave his trade negotiations a year to finish it all off because they were getting stuck on all sorts of obscure things that weren't really central. And he said, look, let's do a trade deal on the things that really matter and get it done in 12 months.
Can you do it over the phone?
The same applies here.
Can you do it over the phone? Just say, well, let's do that. Okay, that's a deal. Right, next. Or is it more well, is it more complicated than that? And if so, why?
Well, it depends really on both sides and what you're willing to do. I mean, for us, the main objective really is to get the prices of the things we pay from the rest of the world down as fast as possible for food and manufacturers, because they are quite costly to our consumers. But another objective, which I'm sure the negotiators will have, will be to open up markets for our services in places like the US and so forth, where they're already pretty open, actually. But, you can always improve things. So I'm sure they'll find lots of things to talk about market opening, particularly in services. But the truth is that if we focus quite strongly on the things that matter to us, which is getting the prices down of food and other manufacturers that we buy around the world, that could be done pretty fast with goodwill on both sides. And as far as we know, there's a lot of goodwill from places like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the US. So I think all the omens are that we could probably do these free trade agreements within a year or two.
Oh, last one, and a quick one here. What's in the interests of the EU when all this shakes down? What do they want?
Well, that's a very good question, Nicky. The trouble is, if it was just economics, I'm sure they'd do a free trade agreement tomorrow. But the problem is, it's all about politics. It's all about showing that you shouldn't leave the EU because it's a great club to belong to, and if you do, it's going to be nasty for you. So they're trying to. There's a lot of pressure on them to be difficult, even though it would be costly for them economically not to have a free trade agreement with us.
So Theresa May's ideal line last night would have been, "Oh, grow up."
Well, I think that's true because. Really, whether other people leave the EU or not, it's got nothing to do with really whether they have an adult relationship with the UK. And that's, I think, what she's hoping to get into their heads over the next few months with the Accelerate idea.
All right. Great. That was a wonderful explanation, Patrick. Thank you very much, Professor Patrick Minford, Professor of Applied Economics at Cardiff Business School. 6:42.